Hey everybody, I'm Brad Miller, and today here with Jason Medford, and we are walking a spiritual path. And if you see the title of this episode today, you may be wondering, what the heck are they talking about? Lord of the Flies. Well, I will say that Jason came up with it, so blame him if you're confused.
I like to have those weird titles,
It it draws attention that way. People are like, Lord of
yeah,
the Flies, what's that? They think we're
yeah,
maybe talking about the book, which we maybe will. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
we'll see where it goes. But specifically, I want to talk about a specific fly. And if we were fortunate, it may actually visit us here a little bit as we're going through this. So, for the past couple of days, I've had a fly on my window, on the inside of my window here in my office. It's a pretty decent sized fly. I would say, I don't know, a couple centimeters at least big. Not like a little gnat or anything or a fruit fly, but a nice sized fly. And in the past, I probably would, maybe go to a fly swatter and kind of shoo it away and like, go leave me alone. But it's kind of doing its own thing. And, so I'm like, all right, you do your thing. I do my thing. You have just every right to be here as I do. So, okay. So he's been there for a couple days. Again, not a big deal. Last night, I was sitting here at my computer and I was, I think, looking through LinkedIn or something. And I saw a post that was liked by someone that I follow. And so I kind of looked at it and I was like, oh, there's like an infographic as part of the picture, but it was a little hard for me to see on the screen. So I clicked on it to expand it to see what it was. And it was a kind of an infographic of kind of the benefits of doing like a cohort sort of program versus a one-to-one coaching or an online course. So a cohort, where you have a small, like a group coaching thing, really, a small group of people, and it's for maybe a set period of time, and you go through it, and you know, and stuff like that. And so I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, because one of the things that I've been kind of putting my attention on recently is that I'm looking for a little bit of guidance, some direction on which way that I should be going. I know in the past we've talked about that, I've kind of been pulled to serving, but I don't know in what capacity, in what way, what it needs to look, what it should look like. And so I've kind of been kind of looking at different things and considering different options, but hasn't really found something that kind of draws me to it. And so when I saw this up there, I'm like, well, okay. I mean, I think that seems like a good idea, that kind of a concept, the cohort idea. And I noticed that this person was offering a free like online course or something, or a free like, webinar or something about it. So I'm like, all right, well, you know what? I'm gonna follow the crumbs and I'll bite. I'll sign up for this webinar thing. After I noticed the fly had landed on that picture on the infographic. So I'm like, well, the fly's there. It hadn't moved from my window as far as I could tell for the last couple of days. And all of a sudden I'm talking about this and it's landing there. And it kind of dances around the page. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to take that as a sign. I'm going to head and sign up. So I did. I signed up for it. I signed up for the course or the webinar that they're doing. And it kind of flew away around a little bit. And the next thing I know, it lands on my arm. And it just sits there for over a minute, just looking at me, not moving, just staring at me with all however many eyes it has. And as I'm sitting there, I'm like, this doesn't feel like an ordinary fly. Like there's something up with this. Like I don't know what it is, but there's something there. And so I'm like, all right, well, I don't think you're an ordinary fly. Who are you? Or what are you? I mean, maybe it's possible that, it's not a who as we traditionally think of that. So, keeping my options open or, whatever here. And after I said that, it flew up my arm and over to a notepad that I have sitting over here on a desk. And the page that it landed on was some notes that I had from one of our mentors on there. And it kind of danced around the page a little bit. right there on top of that, got my attention, and then flew itself off. So I'm like, okay then. And then to top it all off, this morning I come into my office, and not only is our friend here on the windowsill, he has his own little friend who looks pretty much almost identical to him, and it's they're sitting about a foot apart on the window ledge, just staring at each other, and they're not moving. They're just staring for like 5 minutes. They're staring. And as Jason and I, we were talking here, as getting ready to start this episode, I'm like, okay, the fly, whatever. This individual fly came and landed on my computer monitor as we're talking about it. So,
Well, and I think this is a great experience that, kind of encapsulates a lot of the different things we've been talking about, throughout all these 100+ episodes that we've gone through, right? Which is, there's some things about animal medicine that we can talk about, related to flies and what they represent. Our perception of flies, how most people perceive flies versus maybe
mhm,
what the truth is about flies. Things that are out of the ordinary, right? Noticing things that are out of the ordinary and seeing them as signs or omens from the universe, helping to provide us with guidance. And, so I think there's a lot of these things that, we can get in and talk about today. Because I especially, you're watching the fly right now, I can
he's flying
tell.
across. Yep.
Yeah. But because, when things are out of the ordinary, we should pay attention, right? I've started doing that in my life. And so a couple of things, right? Flies only live for about 2 days normally. So isn't it interesting that this fly has been there for 3 or 4 days now, long after the lifespan of a normal fly? It's a big one,
Hmm.
and its movements, the fact that it actually, came to you, landed on your arm, it
Hmm.
wanted to connect with you, right? It's not there to bother you like most people think of flies and try to shoo them away. It was a sentient being, right, who landed on your arm and wanted to connect with you. Now, you had the choice. You could have just shooed it away or you could have swatted it, right? But instead, it sounds like you chose to connect to it. Who are you? What are you? Right?
Hmm.
And, the more that we practice that, the more the messages we can get. To literally sometimes the sentient being will telepathically start communicating with us if we're tuned to it properly,
Hmm.
right? Other times, like this, where it said, oh, okay, well, it jumped up and flew over to a notepad, right?
Hmm.
And landed, that kind of gave you a clue as to what was going on, right? Because it wanted to communicate with you, it wanted to connect with you. And so, yeah, there's lots we can talk about. So, where do you want to start, Brad? I'm like, I can go like 500 places with this.
Yeah, no. Yeah, like I said, it started, like I said, a couple days ago. I noticed it, and it's still hanging around. And again, it's got a friend. I don't know if it's a, you know, yeah, I don't know. They were having had as a new friend this morning. They were kind of hanging out, chilling together. But like you said, it's not usual, or I mean, I don't know how long flies typically last, and what their lifespan ends up being, especially maybe these larger ones. But um, it does seem unusual that's been hanging around the same area and not really doing much else, but just kind of hanging in that same vicinity for a couple of days now. Like I said, that's not something I would think would be typical behavior from a fly.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and when it's not, then we start asking the questions, right?
Hmm.
And again, I think, part of it is, as we've talked about, like recently about connection with our plant relatives.
Hmm.
Well, the fly is a winged one relative, right? It's also a sentient being that's here, whether it's just a fly or more than just a fly, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
again, shapeshifters and other beings sometimes will use animals as ways
Mm-hmm.
to check in on us, as ways to, provide us with clues and guidance, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
again, it sounds like you were receiving some guidance. But I think it's also, a great example for us to really change some of our beliefs, because most people look at things like flies as nasty, dirty,
Right.
disgusting, annoying, right? All these things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people would say, "Oh my gosh, Brad, that fly landed on your arm and it lands on poop and oh, you need to go wash your arm right now," and all this kind of stuff, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
and think of them as nasty, dirty things, but they're not, right? In fact, it's interesting if, everybody is listening, if you want to go look up fly animal medicine online and see what it says because it's totally not how we think about flies in general,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in fact, it's actually a blessing. It's medicine for us when they actually come around. And so instead
Mm-hmm.
of being annoyed, instead of being disgusted, instead of wanting to kill it, right? What if we instead saw it as a relative, saw it as an omen, saw it as, something more than it actually is, and are grateful, for it. I have agreements with flies and mosquitoes as an example. It's like you're okay to be around me, just don't buzz me right in the face, right? I don't mind if you land on me, if you're here with me, that's fine. This is my boundary. I don't want you doing this, right? But as
Mm-hmm.
long as you don't, let's just cohabitate,
Mm-hmm.
because mosquitoes are another one where, if you look up what mosquitoes mean from an animal medicine perspective, it's totally different than what we think. I know we've talked
Mm-hmm.
about turkey vultures before.
Yep.
The same thing, a lot of times people think, oh, vultures, nasty, disgusting, right? But vultures actually help clean as
Mm-hmm.
well. What do flies do? They help clean decay, right? They're attracted to decay. And so there's some cleaning, that goes along with it. Plus, tenaciousness, a whole bunch of other things that you can read into
Mm-hmm.
flies.
Yep. Yeah. And like I said, in the past, I would have just swatted it away. I might have gone and grabbed a fly swatter, done something and try to be like, go away or you're bothering me or whatever. And especially when it landed on my arm, like I would have been like, oh, get off, icky fly, or the shoe fly don't bother me. But but now I just sat there and it kind of it was actually kind of in my arm hair, so it was kind of funny because I was looking at it and it was kind of in the arm hair, it was just kind of looking up at me with, like you said, however, all those eyes, just for over a minute and just kind of staring at me. Um,
Mhm. Well, and I think it's interesting as we place awareness on something like that, especially, it's on your arm for, let's say, a minute, right? I think is kind of what you said.
mhm,
Well, we can also look at it as an opportunity, right, to practice being present.
mhm,
Because as the fly is walking on you, as it's walking, through your arm hairs, there's a certain sensation that happens, and we can choose to be aware of it, and that brings us right
to the present.
into
Mhm,
that present moment. Instead of in focusing on it, trying to connect with it, looking at and trying to understand, what it's bringing to you, right?
mhm,
And even when I mean, you got some, at least for me, and I think for you, some clear signs, right, that it was bringing to you. But even if we don't receive a clear sign at the time, it doesn't mean that we're not getting that animal medicine, from that being.
mhm,
And so a lot of times, again, it's like I'm clueless why, this happens. I mean, I had the other night I was driving back home and it was late and coyote, again, not unusual to see coyotes, but typically when they're crossing the street, in front of a car, they run, right?
Hmm.
No, this one just kind of slowed down in the middle of the road. It turned around, it looked at me, it kind of walked backwards. We sat there for 20 seconds, which is long, right?
Hmm.
As it was just looking at me, and it wasn't in any hurry, it wasn't afraid of the car, right? Now, I don't know necessarily what that means. I know that some beings show up to me in the form of a coyote, um, but I don't know what that particular, experience means. But it was bringing something to me, and I received something, right? Regardless of whether I consciously know what it is or not. Because we don't have to consciously know, because we end up beating ourselves up over it,
Right.
right? And so instead, all I did was I said, I see you, thank you for being here. I accept whatever you're bringing to me. And, you know, that's and realize that again, it's something out of the ordinary. And
Hmm.
so I'm just aware of it, present with it. I mean, there was nobody behind me. I slowed down and effectively stopped, and we just sat there for 20 seconds. And then he or she moved on, right?
Hmm.
And, so I think that's an important thing too, is that while we should be, placing awareness and maybe, recapitulating to try to understand, but we don't have to, which is another thing because I see so many people that when they feel like they have to know what it is, then all of a sudden they move into anxiety. And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily where we want to be, right? So don't feel like you're not doing something right or, you have to figure this out right now. You don't,
Hmm.
right? I think that's a big lesson from these kind of interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing that you mentioned was the idea that something that was out of the ordinary. And that's kind of when, for me, been a key, as I've gone down the spiritual path is noticing, being aware of when something happens that seems out of the ordinary. Like you said, you see coyotes, they're not unusual around the area. And if it was just maybe a fleeting glimpse of one and it buzzed across and it was gone, you may not have thought anything of it. But the fact that in your case, it's kind of went and looked and, wasn't afraid of the car and did some behaviors that you would consider kind of unusual or out of the ordinary, that it kind of stood up and draw your attention. And same thing with this fly. If it would just be doing its thing and I, flying around and just, whatever, I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but it was specifically lands on the page on, on my monitor when I'm looking at a particular image, when it lands on my arm and sits there and stares at you, when it lands on another piece of paper, when it lands on my monitor, as we're talking about it, those are things that stand out as kind of unusual behavior, um, and something to kind of notice, be aware of. And, and again, it's not that I have to know what all of it means. Some of it, I think I probably have a decent idea of what it's supposed to be trying to tell me, but there could be a lot of things that it doesn't matter.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, and because I have interactions with bunnies too, because we have little bunnies that run around.
Hmm.
Most of the time they're just kind of hopping around, easy. But, one time I remember seeing, I didn't realize rabbits could go this fast, but all of a sudden, like screaming down the road, right? This bunny was running like you would not believe. And then there was a coyote behind it, right? So, okay, that makes
Makes
sense.
sense.
Makes sense, right? That's
Hmm.
it's not necessarily out of the ordinary.
Hmm.
But when I see a bunny doing that and they're not being chased by anything, that's a little different.
Hmm.
Or when I see him going along, and literally this was like really out of the ordinary. It just kind of stops and starts like jumping in the air and like doing
A
backflips.
little dance. Yeah.
And it was almost like literally doing a back somersault in the air and kind of jumping up and twisting around. That's not normal either.
That was trying to get your attention, that one.
That one was trying to get my attention, right? So, yeah, I think that's, anything
Hmm.
out of the
Right.
ordinary, right? Not just, I mean, we're talking about our animal interactions, but it
Hmm.
can be lots of different things. Even, you saw something like you saw that post on social media, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes there will be things where all of a sudden there's three things that you see about the same thing all of a sudden, right?
Hmm.
You're thinking about a particular person. All of a sudden you go check your feed on social media. They're at the top of the feed. Well, that's interesting, right?
Hmm.
Something else happens where that person comes up again in a very short period of time. Look at it. If you're seeing threes, something about that person you need to know, right? Maybe it's
Hmm.
time to reach out to them. I don't know. It can be different for each person. But when you see anything that's kind of unusual, in that way, it's good to kind of, I just kind of stop and say, that's interesting, right? Instead of
Right.
saying it's weird, and, spend some attention on becoming aware of what it might mean to me. But same thing, not beating myself up, trying to make sure that I understand it, I get it.
Right.
Because a lot of these things too, they have multiple meanings,
Hmm.
and there's multiple messages that, maybe we receive a certain message at that instant, but a month from now, right, we're thinking about that again, and all of a sudden something else comes to us in a different way. And
Hmm.
so I think, that's important too, is not to um, believe that anything means only one thing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because it could be something that's subconscious,
Mhm.
that's
Well, and,
something.
and that experience could mean something different to you later, right? Like I was listening to a recording this week. I've listened to this recording probably 50 to 100 times, somewhere in that range. And the very first words in that recording hit me differently a couple days ago in a different way. Like I said, I've heard it 50 to 100 times at least,
Hmm.
right? But all of a sudden, I get up in the morning, I put it on and I go, hold it just a minute, right?
Hmm.
I never had that awareness before, right? And for
Hmm.
whatever reason, that time, a couple days ago in the morning, I was given kind of a download of what that means differently, right? And even a lot of the very simple sayings that we hear in ancient texts, in things that we're taught, means so many different things. You are where your attention is. That has so many different meanings, right? Literally,
Hmm.
so many different meanings. And at different points in our life, at different, experiences that we're going through, different meanings come through for any of these interactions or things that we may be having. Right. So,
Hmm.
one thing is never just one thing. And so I think that's part of our spiritual involvement is to, cast off that belief that what we
Hmm.
see, you know, in the 3D, what we see temporally with our eyes is actually what's happening. Or that when somebody says something or we hear something or we have an interaction, that it can only mean one thing because it never does. And I've seen evidence of that lots of times through my life. Um,
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's a great example of that. The message in that recording, and it could be just you were a different place. I mean, because we're constantly changing. Our cells are regenerating, so you're a different person than you were the last time you heard it. It could have just been the things that happened around and the universe kind of aligned, kind of like, think of the planets aligned, or in this
mhm,
case, everything aligned. It's really hard to say what it means, but again, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. You don't have to understand why. Um, you got the message,
mhm.
right? And that's.
Well, and we learn whatever we needed to learn in the moment,
Hmm.
right? Because that's the other thing is with letting go too, which I think is part of that whole idea of not beating ourselves up. A lot of people will go through some experience and they're like, "Oh, I got to work on this. Oh, I gotta, I had this really bad thing happen to me and I've got to work on it and I've got to work through it." And they spend a lot of energy, right, trying to go through and fix it
Mm,
or learn some other lesson. And again, what I've been taught is no, you learned it in the moment. Move on. Let go. You don't have to deal
mhm,
with it. You don't have to dwell on it anymore, right? You learned it. Now, it may come back into your awareness for another reason. Like I said, you may be sitting there and all of a sudden some experience that happened 6 months ago pops back in your head. And
mhm,
there's probably a reason for it, right? If it just randomly pops back in your head, there's probably something else for you to learn in this moment
mhm.
about that experience that you had before.
Right. Yeah. Something you didn't get or something that you just need to do now that's going to help you now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Maybe the next step, right? You
Right.
learn you learn the first part of it, and now you're learning the next part of it.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Trying to think what else that you mentioned about about our fly friend. Um, Again, I don't know if it was a fly. I mean, it was a fly, but maybe it wasn't actually a fly. And that is a possibility that I would not have considered in the past, especially coming from a very logical driven profession, being in the law, being a lawyer. It's all about evidence. What you see, what can you prove? And if I just say I stood there and I looked at this thing on my arm, it looks off like a fly. It must be a fly, you know.
Looks like a fly, talks like a fly, walks like a fly, must be a
Exactly.
fly.
Flies like a fly. Yeah. Yeah, then it must be a fly, right? Um, but as I was sitting there, and in the past, I mean, that's my mind would have been closed to anything else. This is a fly, obviously. Move on. But in the moment, when I was staying there staring at it, and it was staring back at me with all those eyes, I started to question, is this actually a fly? Is it just a fly? Is it something else? In addition, or like just the possibilities out there, a lot more open now to things that are not as maybe they appear to be at first glance.
Yeah, because, and again, this is part of the spiritual path. Some of you I know that are listening are like, why are you guys talking about flies so much? Let's just, you know, but it's a lesson spiritually. Because again, in this world, we're taught, right? Brad was taught that that thing that landed on his arm is a fly. You call it a fly, right? And it does these different things, and he perceives the energy of that being as a fly, right? Because he's been taught, he's been indoctrinated that that's what a fly looks like,
Right.
and so
Yep, that's my interpretation.
he
Hmm.
physically sees a fly. But the reality is, it's not a fly. We label it a fly, but it's not a fly. And so, again, this is where it can be a little, right? But
And
it's
see, now
it's
we're
it's
jumping down
again,
this rabbit hole. Yeah.
yeah, it's part of the rabbit hole. We'll go a little bit, but we won't go too far. But even just from a quantum physics standpoint, what we physically perceive in matter and we see with our 3D eyes is not the actual energy of what we're looking at. It has a geometric energy signature, right? We just perceive that signature as being a fly. But if we could truly see that fly, we would see its energy, right? It's a sentient being. It has, if you want to call it a soul or whatever. Uh, and if we could actually see it for what it really was, we would actually perceive the energy, not the form, right? And that's part of the spiritual path, right? And I think it's, part of it is us giving up our beliefs
Mhm.
of, the things that we see or that we think we see is not actually what we see, because almost nothing that happens to us is what we actually are perceiving.
Mm.
Right? We are just choosing to perceive based on our uh, uh, perceptions, right? That are based on our indoctrinations and beliefs.
Yep.
And anything is never just one thing, right? So
Hmm.
I have something right here, and everybody who's watching on YouTube, right, can see it because we're not really doing the audios anymore. So what am I holding, Brad?
It appears from a 3D standpoint to be a pen.
A pen. But is it really a pen? Right? It looks like a pen. I can write with it, right? And so we're taught that that's a pen, right? It's not a pencil because it uses ink. And so we've been taught that a pencil uses graphite to write. A pen uses some kind of ink, right? Gel ink or whatever, right? But, and so I think most people would say this is a pen. Now it has certain colors, right?
Mhm.
So what colors do you see on there too?
There's black, there's some kind of a gold color, and it's either a maroon or a brown. It's kind of hard to tell from the camera, but
Oh, maroon or brown. Yeah, because it's again, everybody might perceive that as something different, right? I see it's kind of a brown and blackish pattern on it, right? And it's brass. It's a metal pin, right? And so these are brass, but looks like gold,
right.
right? And so the thing is well, one person may perceive it as gold, another person may perceive it as brass, right?
Mhm.
Is it gold? Is it brass? Well, that's in the perception of the person who's looking at it. Is it
Mhm.
maroon or is it brown? That's the perception of the person who's looking at it. But what is it
Mhm.
really? It's energy. Everything is energy. But because I believe that it's a pen, I can hold it in my hand. When that item is energy, it's only matter and I can only pick it up because I believe I can. It's mainly space. What? Well, because every atom is 99% space, which
Mhm.
means 99% of this pen is just air. So I shouldn't be able to pick it up,
Mhm.
but I can because of the 3D that we're in here, right? And so I think it's one of those where part of the spiritual path is starting to see things for what they really are and not what we've just been taught they are.
Mhm.
Because can the pen be used for something else too?
Sure.
Of course it can, right? I mean, if you've seen the John Wick movies, right? He killed three guys with a pencil. Okay. So, a pen could be used as a weapon,
It
you
is
know,
mightier than the sword after all.
and it is, right? So, um, I guess mightier than a 9 millimeter too sometimes, but um, but that's part of our process is going beyond. Philosophy talks about it as a qualia, right? But it's the idea of going beyond the qualia. And if you want to know what that means, look it up online. Okay, but that's from philosophy. Um, and part of our spiritual path is to go beyond the qualia, go beyond what we are just physically perceiving and
Mhm.
see what it really is. Because that wasn't just a fly, it was also a sentient being, right? Can you see it as that? Can you see it as no different than you? Can you see it as something that, has every right to live that we do as
Mhm.
well, right? Can you see it as, hey, maybe it was a shapeshifter. Maybe it was someone coming through, that animal from a shape-shifting perspective to check in on Brad. Make sure Brad's doing okay. Bring Brad some messages, right? And again, Who that might be? That's again, we could go down a rabbit hole on that and talk about a whole episode on who it could be. Um, but it's taken those baby steps, and to me, first starting to just connect, just starting to see the fly as something different than what most people perceive it as.
Hmm.
And we start working from there,
Right.
right? I mean, someone who is tuned frequent, tuned properly would see the soul and energy of that fly and
Hmm.
connect with it directly, right? Um, Most of us aren't there, but we're working towards it. That's part of the path.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, was it a fly? What? Yeah. It could have been a lot of things. And like I said, in the past, I would have just kind of shrugged it off as it's just a fly. But walking the path again is kind of increased my awareness of other things. It's increased my awareness that things aren't as they seem, that there's more than meets the eye. Um, and like you said, in things like, the fact that it is a sentient being, that it is no different than us. You could talk about the pen being 99% air. We are too. The fly is. So at that rate, we're all just 99% nothing. Like, I mean, if you really want to start breaking it down, um, and like I said, it's a step. The easiest step is to see it as, okay, is it is it not the pest that I have been taught to believe it is. Most people are saying, oh, flies are a pest, they're a bother, maybe they're dirty, they have diseases, carry diseases, things like that. First step, getting past that, saying that, okay, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's not a pest. Maybe it has just every right to be here as I do. Flies were here before we were. I'm sure they will be here long after we are long off this planet. Um, and then you can slowly start peeling away and going backwards of, before you start getting to the balls of energy and everything else and that kind of stuff. But
Mhm.
um,
It just starts slow, but I think,
yeah.
again, that's why I remember we did a couple episodes on what is spirituality. And
Hmm.
to me, a lot of it is in that connectedness. It's starting to learn that everything, we are all connected, we are all one. And having things like flies in this world is one of those ways for us to learn that lesson. Especially when it's something that seems, oh, dirty, filthy, kind of thing.
Hmm.
But it's not. Bats are another one. I mean,
Hmm.
the other night I was just sitting there watching these three or four bats fly around. And same thing, most people, think of bats as dirty, nasty things.
Vampires, Draculas, all that kind of
Vampires, all,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, again, go look up animal medicine, right?
Hmm.
And
Bats are a powerful one.
they're very powerful shaman medicine. And
Hmm.
so, if we can just start to change our perspective a little bit at a time,
Yeah.
but use some of these what seem to be everyday occurrences as ways to learn and to grow and evolve.
Yeah.
So
So, yeah, so if there's anything else about my fly you want to talk about, but
I
um,
think that's probably good for today. The
we
Lord of the
we
Fly. We'll have to see how long he chooses to hang around.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for listening, and have a great week. Start looking for these things that are out of the ordinary, and just take little baby steps. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
we're doing. And we'll see you on the next video.
See you guys then.